So let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to talk about the Valley victory, the Battle of Cedar Creek, 1864. And many of you probably have heard of it, but may not know the details or even have not heard of it at all. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll go to the next slide. And this map will orient you to the location of where we're talking about. So you can see Washington, D.C. over on the right, and the railroad there that runs from Alexandria through Front Royal to Strasburg. Once you go through the gap there, that's Manassas Gap to Front Royal, you're in the Shenandoah Valley at that point. Front Royal is on the Shenandoah River, Strasburg just a little bit west of there. And then I've put a star, well, a yellow and red kind of marker there with an arrow pointing to Cedar Creek battlefield. And it is between Strasburg and Winchester. It's a little bit closer to Strasburg than Winchester. But this gives you the lay of the land. The red dot is Strasburg, the orange one is Winchester, and then if you can see the green dot up at the top, that is Harper's Ferry. And this was the area of operations for the Union forces, who at this time were led by Major General Phil Sheridan, and the Confederate forces, who were led by Lieutenant General Jubal Early. So these were smaller armies than what we see over at Petersburg and Richmond at this time, but nevertheless significant. All right, let's go on to the next slide, and we will talk about the Union Army first here. This was the Army of the Shenandoah, and it was commanded by Phil Sheridan, who Grant brought with him from the West when Grant was appointed to be the commander-in-chief of all Union forces in the U.S. Fighting the Confederacy. And he brought Sheridan with him to command his cavalry corps for much of the campaign, which he did. Sheridan was a very hard-hitting general, very aggressive, and by the time the fall or late summer and fall of 1864 came, the Federals needed to put an army over into the northern Shenandoah Valley to face the threat of Confederates attacking Washington, D.C., which they had done earlier that summer. So Sheridan was appointed to command a variety of troops over there, including some troops from the Army of the Potomac, what was known after that as the Army of West Virginia, which was the 8th Corps under General Crook, the 19th Corps under General Emory, and then the 6th Corps, which was an Army of the Potomac unit under General Wright. He also had some cavalry as well. So let's go on to the next screen, and we'll take a look at the Confederate Army of the Valley. Now, the Federals had about 10,000 more troops at this point than the Confederates did, but General Early had his troops divided into 5 infantry divisions, which you can see there, and 1 cavalry division, which at this particular juncture in Confederate military history was weaker than it normally had been earlier in the war. And Early was not really a lover of cavalry forces, and some historians have interpreted this as his being not really able to use them well. But this was the force, and we're going to be talking a lot about these several officers, particularly Gordon and Wharton. Okay, let's move on then to continue our story. The Shenandoah Valley in 1864 was a very important area of operations for the Confederacy and the Union. For the Confederacy, it meant being able to defend a very important region of grain production, food production, fodder for horses, and other supplies such as hogs, cattle, that fed Lee's primary forces in Richmond and Petersburg. So it was very important that this be defended and that the farmers be able to harvest crops and provide smoked and treated meat to go over to the east. So the forces operating there had started really in the summer And Early had led a raid of Washington in July through Maryland and attacked Washington, D.C. from the north. So this resulted in the Battle of Monocacy on July 9th, which is in Maryland, right near Frederick, Maryland. It was a Confederate victory and led Early to move on to the D.C. line and attack Fort Stevens. But the Northern troops were able to, the Northern officers were able to get the troops into position to prevent Early from successfully invading the District of Columbia. So he wound up retreating back into Maryland and Virginia. On the 24th of July, the forces met again, the Second Battle of Kernstown, which is just south of Winchester. And that was another Confederate victory by Early over General Crook, who led forces from what would eventually become West Virginia. But by September 19th, things started to look very bleak for the Confederates. They were soundly defeated by Sheridan, who by this time had taken over command in the valley and was able to inflict a crushing defeat on the army of Early in September at the Third Battle of Winchester. So this was again September 19th in 1864. And shortly thereafter, after Early had retreated to Fisher's Hill, which is just south of Strasburg, which is a great defensive position, but he did not have enough troops to be able to really man all the defenses. And he was defeated again by Sheridan and routed, had to retreat all the way down south to the Harrisonburg, Mount Crawford area. The Federals were able to move back toward Winchester, but they burned a considerable amount of the barns and mills of the Shenandoah Valley from just north of Stanton on up into the Strasburg area. So then Early then moved north down the valley again in October, but it was part of his forces, not all of his troops, but a part of his forces were defeated at the Battle of Tom's Brook, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, between Woodstock, in the Woodstock area, between Newmarket and Strasburg. It was another defeat of his forces. And at that point, the Union command, both Grant and Sheridan, really regarded this as a turning point because they thought that after Early's defeat at Winchester, Fisher's Hill, and then again at Tom's Brook, that there really was no Confederate threat. So Sheridan, with Grant's blessing, started to make preparations to move a significant part of his troops, including the 6th Corps and part of the 19th Corps, to Richmond and Petersburg to support the efforts there of Grant to break the siege, attack Petersburg, and hopefully end the war. Well, Early recognized that, and Early knew that he had to act aggressively to prevent the troops of the Union troops from leaving the valley and reinforcing Grant. So he had one more offensive in him, basically, and his troops, who by this time, even though they had lost the Battle of Fisher's Hill and before that Winchester, they were actually in pretty fine spirits, and they were, while not as well supplied as the Federal forces, they were ready to go. And I think they recognized that something significant had to happen here in order to prevent the Union troops from leaving the northern lower end of the valley and move by way of Front Royal and on to Richmond to help with the siege. So now that Early decided that he was going to go on the offensive, let's see what happens with his plan. So we'll move on to the next screen. And I'll show you the map here of these places. The orange dot there you can see is Winchester, and I'm telling you where these are just in case you whatever screen you're on, you're having trouble reading the map. The red dot is Middletown, and that's where, right in that area, is where the Battle of Cedar Creek would mostly occur, through Middletown to the north and the south and the west of it. So just kind of keep that in mind. You can see some pictures here of Fisher's Hill. The X on the map is marking Fisher's Hill, and there's an image of Fisher's Hill, two images, one looking from Fisher's Hill to the east over to Signal Knob, and I have the arrow pointed at Signal Knob. That's part of the end of Massanutten Mountain where the Confederates had a signal station. And if you look over on the map, where the green X is on the bottom of the map, that's Signal Knob that overlooks Strasburg, Middletown, Front Royal. So it's a great vantage point. If we have time at the end and I remember, I'll tell you a little story about Fisher's Hill that happened last week. So, but we'll keep going here on our narrative. So Sheridan's forces were concentrated, and I'll show you this in a minute on a different map. They were focused along Cedar Creek, just north of Cedar Creek. And I've put an arrow, a blue arrow pointing to, a narrow blue arrow pointing to Cedar Creek that kind of winds its way around and joins up with the Shenandoah River. And they moved in the middle of October to a high ground called Hupp's Hill, which I have marked with that short arrow, the blue arrow, and that was a position that they took on October 13th. And early moved some forces there, which greatly surprised Sheridan and the other Union leaders, because they did not get wind of an advance by Early, and they certainly did not expect him to act aggressively. So at this point, having seen Early so close to their positions and in the northern part of the Shenandoah Valley, Sheridan quickly rescinded the orders for the troops to leave the valley and join Grant, because he was unsure of what was happening. Because of all this confusion before the Battle of Cedar Creek on the 19th, Secretary Stanton, the Secretary at War, was very confused on what to do and called a conference and asked Sheridan to meet him in conference in the Washington area. So Sheridan began to make plans to leave and go by train to Washington. All right, next slide, please. So this was a part of a new, again, like I said, a renewed offensive in the valley. And we've already gone over Early's plan, but he managed to collect as many troops as possible. He had artillery with him, some cavalry, and again, this was going to be the attempt in middle and late October to try to prevent Sheridan from reinforcing Grant. All right, next slide, please. So one of the things that happened prior to the Confederates planning to attack the northern camps, which were around Middletown on the north bank of Cedar Creek, was that General Gordon and the Army's chief engineer, Captain Jed Hotchkiss, they went up on Signal Knob, where they were able to use the telescopes there and observe the positions of the Union troops while they were in their camps. And immediately below Signal Knob is the Shenandoah River, and Cedar Creek flows into the Shenandoah River just below Signal Knob as well. And Gordon developed a plan, which I'll show you a map in a second, but his plan was to take his troops and go on a flanking maneuver to hit the Union camps on their left flank by marching along the Shenandoah River on the south bank, which in this picture is on our right of the image. And he was planning to march on the high ground that you can see on the right overlooking the river and get beyond the Union left flank in their camps unsuspecting, while the other Confederate forces moved across Cedar Creek to the west. That was his plan. And there's a great image there on the left, drawn at the time, shortly thereafter, showing Gordon and Hotchkiss observing the enemy's position, the Union Army's position. All right, next slide, please. So this is an image of Gordon here. This is Gordon's plan. You can see Middletown is on the upper right, and the camps of the Union forces are marked by cavalry, 6th Corps, 19th Corps, and Army of West Virginia. And those are the blue words there. They're all on that east side of Cedar Creek along the Valley Pike. The Valley Pike, for those of you who don't know, if you are in the Shenandoah Valley, today that's Route 11. So you can see the dotted red line at the bottom of your map. That's the route that Gordon proposed to take below the Shenandoah River and cross the Shenandoah River, attacking the Army of West Virginia and the other Union forces from the south behind them and on their flank. Kershaw's division would be the middle division that crossed Cedar Creek and hit the 19th Corps from the southwest, and a smaller division under General Wharton would move from Hupp's Hill, just north of Strasburg, on excuse me, the Valley Pike, across Cedar Creek and assist in this attack. So a very daring plan, but if you remember that this was really what Early knew, that he had troops with him, he had the artillery to support him, and his intelligence really reported that the Union camps were largely undefended. There were some trenches done preventively, but they were unsuspected and not very well dug in for an attack. Okay, so we got the Union Army along the Cedar Creek and north of the Shenandoah, and the Confederates planning to attack in the very early morning hours of October 19th. The actual march that you see here and these troops getting into position started on the 18th. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this is a view of Strasburg, and the Confederate troops were camped around Strasburg and also back on Fisher's Hill. And Jen, let's go back one slide, and I'll see if that slide has, yeah, you can see Fisher's Hill on the far bottom left-hand corner of that map, and the dotted line starts from in that area. So Gordon and Kershaw, Gordon didn't even go to Strasburg. He went all along the Shenandoah River, whereas Kershaw and Wharton came from Strasburg across Hupp's Hill and got in position. Okay, let's go back. And yeah, okay, so this is Strasburg here. It's a view of the town today. And the Stickley farm is still there. That house is still there. That is very visible from Route 11 on the northbound lane, the southbound lanes. And the bridge that crossed Cedar Creek at the time was behind this house and to the right. The Valley Pike ran in front of this house, made a turn just beyond it to go behind the house, and then made another turn to the right to get over Cedar Creek. That's not the way it is today, but the bridge abutments are still there. So if you're ever on an official tour you can see those, but the Stickley farm is private property. But you can definitely see the house easily from the road. All right, next slide. Okay, let's talk a little bit about who was over in the camps on the Union side. So let's go from the top down, and you can see two rectangle shapes with a single line running diagonally from it at the top of the map. One says Custer. I think we've all heard of Custer. Cavalry at the northern end of the Union line. Below that, you see Merritt, another cavalry division or brigade right there that you can see. And then from top to bottom, you see the Roman numerals. 6th Corps was General Wright. Below that, the 19th Corps under General Emory. And below that was the crook of the 8th Corps, as I said before, sometimes known as the Army of West Virginia. So they were running from north to south along Cedar Creek, and they were defending Cedar Creek and had assumed that any attack would come somewhere in the direction of Strasburg across the creek on the bridge. But as you can see here, the right flank attack by Gordon crossed the north branch of the Shenandoah. The middle arrow you see there is Kershaw crossing Cedar Creek, and then up along the Valley Pike, Wharton with the red arrow, he crossed at and near the bridge. And they all were coming down heavily on the 8th and 19th Corps, attacking in the morning before the sunup. And in fact, most of Kershaw's division had already crossed by the time it even got light out. And as soon as it became light enough to see, these Confederate troops advanced to attack. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit more detailed, and I want to mention that this is a Hal Jesperson map. Hal is an incredibly talented cartographer who often makes his work available for programs like this, and his work is excellent, and many of you have seen his works in modern Civil War books and magazines, and also on websites. So you can see Gordon's march in red down at the bottom of the map, moving from our left to right. And he crossed at 2 fords, including Bowman's Ford. And the house that you see in the little picture on the right is Long Meadow Farm. And I've drawn a blue arrow to where that farm is located. That house is still there. You can see it from the road. It's private property. It's easier to see in the wintertime. But that's where Gordon crossed to advance. And you can see that Kershaw crossed at Bowman's Mill Ford. That's the middle arrow on the map for going from our left to right. And he crossed that and deployed in a field, and immediately upon being able to see, advanced on one of Crook's 8th Corps divisions under General Thoburn, whose men were still in their camps. And then you can see the top arrow is the advance of Wharton's troops, who took the Valley Pike northbound and were attacking across Cedar Creek. And you remember I mentioned that several days prior to this engagement, that Early had advanced to Hupp's Hill to attack and demonstrate, meaning to see what the Union positions were and what their forces were. That's you can see on the left-hand side of the map where there's a red burst and it says Hupp's Hill. That was on the 13th, but I wanted to show you where that was in relationship to this. And you can see by this map and the dotted lines mean retreat. That's not a good thing if your team has dotted lines behind it. And these divisions under Crook and Grover and McMillan and Hayes, they crumbled. And there are all sorts of accounts, and I really can't go into them in great detail, but there are soldier accounts and even civilian accounts who saw part of the battle, that a lot of these troops had to run when they weren't even dressed. They didn't take their equipment. They were completely surprised. Some of them were shot and bayoneted while they were still in their tents. There's an incredible account of someone who wrote after the war that when they were just 9 or 10 years old, that they walked through the camps after the Confederates had cleaned through them before the battle was even over, and just saw hundreds and hundreds of Union troops laying dead or wounded because they were completely, totally surprised by these attacks. And if you look at the progress, particularly of Gordon's division on the right after he crossed Bowman's Ford, they're advancing well onto the Valley Pike. Kershaw's men rolled up Thoburn during this retreat. Eventually, I think we have a map in a second, but Thoburn was killed during the retreat by Confederates that caught up with them in or near Middletown. So these men were completely routed. The Union troops were. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned that Kershaw's division crossed Cedar Creek at Bowman's Mill Ford. So there's no ford there now, but there is a one-lane bridge right there that you can see on the creek, and that picture of Cedar Creek is looking upstream from the bridge. Excuse me. So this is where Kershaw's division crossed. The Bowman's Ford, where Gordon's division crossed, is downstream along the Shenandoah, and that is not available to public examination. You can't go on that property. All right, next, please. And then this next image, this is where Kershaw deployed. So when Kershaw came across that ford we just saw in the prior slide, Cedar Creek is in that tree line just beyond those trees, and Kershaw deployed his division from right to left in this field, and then moved toward us, the viewer, and slightly to our right, kind of oblique right, going kind of toward us, but it would pass us on our right up to the Union position. And again, Kershaw's men, they were ready to go so early that as soon as they could make out anything, any individual trees and fences, they went right away. They were really, really eager to go. All right, next slide, please. Now, this is where Thoburn's division of the 8th Corps camps were. There's a small pullout there that is only really big enough for one car, but a lot of this ground here where the 8th Corps, particularly Thoburn's division, was camped, from the knoll where they were camped all the way down to Cedar Creek and to the right, has been preserved by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, which has trails there and it's easily accessible. But you can kind of get the picture where this is the high ground, and a lot of the entrenchments were to our front and to our right. They weren't always manned, but you can see the drop off. You can get a sense of the drop off by looking. You can see that that round bale on the left, and just beyond that is a white structure, and that sits down nearer to the creek, and that shows you what the elevation is. Way in the distance is the far side of the valley, the west side. That's Little North Mountain that runs quite a ways on the west side of the valley. If you're going down I-81, you get a good picture of that for a long time, all the way down to Newmarket. So this is where the Union troops ran from. This is where they're at least in this division. Next, please. All right, another map here. This is kind of the follow-on map. You can see that Gordon gets to Route 11, Valley Pike, and hits Hayes's division. The troops that you see on the right that show Crook, that are all a bunch of little dots there, that means that they were routed, disorganized, and they all started to congregate around, and you can see right in the middle of that map is a black dot. It says Belle Grove, and that was a large plantation. You can see over on the left is an image of the house that's still standing. It's built in 1797, I think. Now, you can see on this map that some of the Union troops to the north that were part of the 6th Corps, they're starting to move south to try to help and shore up any Union defense and give the routed troops kind of a place to rally and to counter this onslaught of Confederate troops. Wright again was a very experienced general, not the stellar performer of Sheridan and what Grant wanted him to be, but on this particular day used his divisions the best he could to try to regroup his army and make good what was really a terrible situation. Some of the troops you can see that are just to the left of Middletown under Crook, they're moving toward town, trying to get up north down the valley through Middletown and escape. Okay, next slide, please. Again, quick look at Belle Grove. The original part is that center part, that extension on the left that you can see behind the small trees that was added later. But this is part of Cedar Creek and Belle Grove battlefield. This is operated and interpreted by the National Park Service. Great site. The house, you can tour the house. You can do a car tour with key stops all along the battlefield. I recommend it highly. And it's, again, between just very, very short distance from Strasburg near Middletown. Okay, next slide. All right, so the new situation you can see here is that the Confederates start crossing the Valley Pike. They've already overrun the Army of West Virginia. They've already overrun much of the 19th Corps divisions under Emory and Grover. And you can see that the 6th Corps divisions, which I just said in the last slide, were trying to move to the defense and assistance of their fellow soldiers. They were turned back. You can see the blue arrows turning back from the Confederate attack and just overwhelmed all around the grounds of Belle Grove. And one of the interesting things about going to Belle Grove and those fields around it is there's some illustrations done of the battle right afterwards. And you can see this fight was raging all around that house, all around the field to the south and the east of there toward the Valley Pike. And Wheaton, Kiefer, those divisions just turned back. One division under Getty, and you can see Getty down below. I've got images there below of some of the Confederates and Merritt's cavalry. If you look right at the top center of the map, it says Getty. Getty had 3 brigades and brought them from his camps on the northern end of the Union line over to the town cemetery on a significant hill just west of the town of Middletown. And that was great ground, put artillery up there, and was trying to create some kind of a line there so that Union troops could rally, turn around, get in line, and defend against the advancing Confederates. And up at the top of the screen, you see three brigades along Cedar Creek. They're blue and white rectangles. Those are cavalry brigades under Merritt, who decided that he needed to move over to the Middletown Valley Pike area. Cavalry operates best when it can be near roads, and he knew that the attack was over in that area, so he shifted troops, which would turn out to be quite valuable within not too much time. And one other thing I'll point out here is very significant. This attack, again, started around daybreak, around 5:30 in the morning, and the Confederates were already across the Valley Pike, defeating every unit that they came against by 7:30 in the morning. So this was not only a Union rout in some of the units and a defeat for others, But this all happened very, very quickly. Keep that in mind. Okay, Jen, let's see the next slide here, please, and I'll show you the progress here. Now, this is the area west of the Valley Pike, looking across the fields where the Union troops moved from left to right, trying to get out of the way, trying to find better ground or somewhere to rally. That's a period house there called the Heater House. Belle Grove is just off the left of this map, in the near foreground, and the troops were pushed off of that position at Belle Grove and to the area around the Heater House and beyond. In fact, Jen, go back one slide and I'll show you where this is on the map. If you look on the map, if you see the words Valley Pike, if you look at the word Valley, go and across just north of the Valley Pike, the white road there, into that open field to the right of Belle Grove. That's where the Heater House was, and that's where all this, what you see in that image. Let's go back to that image, Jen. That's what you're looking at right there, is the Union troops retreating from our left to the house and to the distance to the right. Okay, next slide, please. Now, in this slide, you can see we're at about 9:30 in the morning. Crook's men of the Army of West Virginia, again, the 8th Corps, they've moved in a disorganized fashion, a mob beyond Middletown now, down the Valley Pike. Merritt has joined them there to give them a little bit of support to rally them. But the main action keeps taking place west of Middletown and east-northeast of Belle Grove. Kershaw and Evans attack Ricketts' 6th Corps division, push them back again. Emory's 19th Corps has kind of collected themselves behind Ricketts' division, but still wildly disorganized. And the divisions of Pegram, Wharton, and Ramseur, they attack Getty on the cemetery. Now, at this point, if ever so slightly in this area, the Confederate attack starts to slowly run out of gas. And they're still making progress, but Getty makes such a stiff resistance in the area of the cemetery and just beyond it. And Early, according to several of his contemporaries at the time, wastes a lot of time trying to attack them front on, makes 3 or 4 separate assaults, brings artillery up to try to blast them off that hill, when in hindsight, at least 1, possibly 2 of those divisions that are heading straight at Getty should have been used to support the left flank with Kershaw and Evans, because if they had pushed them even farther back, Getty would have been flanked, and on his right, there would have been Confederates in his rear, and he would have had no choice but to retreat anyway. There's an old military adage that you reinforce success, and the left flank of the Confederates was the successful one here. And once again, this is a great Hal Jesperson map that researchers, scholars, and presenters like myself owe a lot to him for making these available. So, okay, next slide. Okay, here's a great shot. This is a National Park Service image from their website. And this is the cemetery hill that Getty's division, the 6th Corps, occupied. And if we were there at the battle right now, we would be looking toward the direction of the Confederate attack. In other words, the Confederates were coming at us from the low ground in the front and slightly to our right. Getty had 1 brigade that was off to the right out of this picture, but you can see the tremendous hill advantage here. We're looking above the trees there into the distance. You can see Signal Knob again. There are 3 knobs at the end of the Massanutten Range, right at Front Royal and Strasburg, and Signal Knob is the westernmost one. You can see that right there. So this is a great shot of Getty's position. And this cemetery is open to the public, and there's a Park Service interpretive signs. You can walk all around here and get a great feel for how good this position was. Okay, next. Now, at this point, there came to be what was called the fatal halt. And it's about 10 o'clock in the morning, 10:30. Getty's division finally pushed off the cemetery knob, the high ground there, and General Gordon and other officers were urging Early to keep the pursuit, keep going, keep going. They've been routed. We've got a victory here. And Early seemed to think, well, my men are tired. They're hungry. They've won enough for one day. We've won a battle. And Early was not interested in pursuing. And no matter what Gordon would say, and others, he would not be convinced. And by halting here, the attack and the momentum for Early's army basically waned. And there was no better Union general in the Eastern Theater to take advantage of someone losing the initiative than Phil Sheridan. And that is really the second half of the story. So let's move on, and we'll talk about that for the most part. The Confederates occupied a line along a road and lane northwest of Middletown. Middletown is to the south of this map, off the map to the bottom. And they had put their right flank along the Valley Pike, which is over on the right side of the map where you see Merritt's name. And not in this map, but to the Confederate right and below them, just south of this map, were 2 more divisions, 2 more brigades. So there were troops just on the Pike too. But this lane and the position starts. There's at the Miller House. There was an old mill there, not there, but the Miller House itself, you can see in the background in that image. That's still standing in today. That anchored the right-hand side of this red line that you see there. And the Army of the Shenandoah began to rally, mostly because the Sherman showed up. And before I forget, this is a map provided to us courtesy of the American Battlefield Trust and their website. They have a lot of good maps like this, and they always support the National Museum and our programs with images and maps. So thank you very much to the Trust for this, as usual. So when Sheridan, again, if you remember, he was on his way to Washington to confer with Stanton. But as he got to the train north of here, heard gunfire and cannon fire from Winchester, which is something like 16 or 20 miles away. I don't have that handy. And decided, well, that sounds like a battle, and that was that morning in the pre-dawn hours, and he made his famous ride from Winchester to Cedar Creek, meaning basically the Union lines north of Middletown, and rallied the troops. And as he was coming down the Valley Pike with a very small contingent of cavalry guards, he would come across individual soldiers or groups of 5, 6, 10, 20 soldiers who were retreating and trying to get out of the way. And he managed to, with his enthusiasm and his threats, to get them to rally and turn around and come back to the Army of the Shenandoah's position, which you can see here north of town. So let's go ahead to the next slide. These are just some illustrations of Sheridan's ride. That's a period illustration on the left, done right after the battle, and then a little bit later, a wood carving or a lithograph of Sheridan rallying the troops and bringing them back toward the lines that General Wright of the Sixth Corps had managed to establish with the survivors of the rout and whatever good troops he had. Next slide, please. So this is a great image that was done just after the battle of the Union counterattack. So once Sheridan got his troops in line and got them in order, he put them in two ranks, two lines here, and moved them back up the Valley Pike south to strike at Early. And you can see the road in the distance, not the one where you see where the stone walls are in the foreground, but the one in the distance that goes left to right toward the White House. That is the Valley Pike. And that was the axis of the advance toward the Confederate lines, which you see there on the right-hand side. So that's just north of Middletown. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the ground around which the counterattack was launched, and Sheridan rallying the troops. And the spot on a lane that you can drive to today, that around this creek is kind of running north to south here. Sheridan arrives at this point where the army is, and instantly arranges and then orders an attack right away. And so we are looking at the direction of the attack. So the attack started off along both sides of this stream toward that barn. And then in the image of the left, these are some of the open fields that the Union troops started moving toward Confederate lines, moving from our left to the right in the distance. All right, very easily seen today. Okay, let's move on one slide. So here we are toward the end of the battle. This is the Union counterattack. Now, Sheridan arrived at 10:30 in the morning, and it didn't take too long after that to start getting the troops in position, but it took quite a while to bring in the cavalry of Custer, get Merritt aligned, and to dress the lines and figure out where to go. So by the time these folks were reinforced, the Union troops were reinforced and realigned. The stragglers were put as best they could back into line. The attack launched around 4 o'clock. And you can see that the Merritt's cavalry is right on the Valley Pike. And then from our right to left, you see the divisions going from Getty all the way to the Union right on our left. Custer's cavalry. They attacked, they hit that Confederate line that was anchored where that red brick house was, pushed them back through the town of Middletown and the fields, the cemetery where the Confederates had pushed Getty off of, past Belle Grove, where they had routed the Union troops, and all the way down the Valley Pike. It was a complete reversal of fortune. Custer and Merritt and their cavalry troopers were instrumental in keeping the rout going and not allowing the Confederates to get any position to rally on. They were really spent at this point. Next slide, please. Another map of the same area. I wanted to get a little bit more detailed map. Again, this is an American Battlefield Trust map. The blue lines are where the Union troops began their counterattack. The red line is where Early's troops had stopped right after the fatal halt that I was telling you about. Middletown is right where that oblong red colored disc is, and the Confederates were not instantly, but quickly pushed back, particularly when Custer and Merritt were on their flanks. Okay, next slide, please. This is the Spangler's Mill, which you can see the picture there. But if you look to the right picture, the valley, that's the Valley Pike, Route 11. The village of Strasburg, which I had an earlier image of, is up that road into the trees, and it starts right up there in the hill and kind of turns to the right. That's where the prime village is. This was the avenue of the Confederate retreat, and you can see there's a little bridge. If you can see, there's a white cement line that runs across that road right where it starts to turn up the hill. That's where the original little bridge was, and through some mistake or error, a wagon or two wagons or an artillery piece or something jammed up the one-lane Valley Pike there and prevented the easy movement of troops out of Strasburg, Confederate troops retreating out of Strasburg. There was a panic there, and the cavalry coming at them. The view of Spangler's Mill, the image on the right is taken from Spangler's Mill, and then when I turned around, I took the picture of Spangler's Mill. You can see now the Valley Pike is on the right, and that crosses the Shenandoah, not that far down. But this was the direction of the retreat of Early's army and the pursuit by the army of the Shenandoah, that was the Union troops. All right, next slide. Okay, so complete, by this time, Union victory. The Confederates are routed, much like the Battle of Winchester a month beforehand. Union Army losses, you can notice a significant number of wounded men, which is kind of remarkable here, but that comes from the nature of the surprise attack. This wasn't a head-on, front-to-front battle for the whole day long, because in the morning, the surprise achieved by the Confederates was remarkable, and that really contributes to the number that were wounded. Also, look at the almost 1,600 captured. That was during the beginning of the battle, and then on toward Belle Grove plantation. These captured during the battle. Once troops were captured, the units were assigned to rush them to the rear to get them away from the battlefield, so they couldn't be liberated and put back into the fighting. So that's why you see a pretty large contingent of Union captured or missing. Confederate losses, about half the number of killed, half the number wounded, but about the same, 2/3 the same as captured. And most of those captured were all after the counterattack. So this was really it. That was the end of the battle. The the Confederate troops wound up retiring way down the Shenandoah Valley, up the Shenandoah Valley, I should say. South, let's say that. Sheridan pursued with cavalry to a certain extent, but wasn't totally clear that there weren't more Confederate troops in the valley. This was the last large-sized battle. Later on, in February, 4 months after this battle, there was one final engagement between Union cavalry and the remainder of Early's force, which by that time, in February of 1865, they were down to about 1,200 to 1,400 men. They were routed in about 20 minutes at a very short but a kind of finale at Waynesboro, Virginia, in southeastern Augusta County. So that's the Battle of Cedar Creek, a remarkable story about Sheridan rallying the troops. And I'll see if we have any questions here. You have to bear with me. It's a little hard to read because it shows up very small on my screen. What was Early's army doing between 1030 and 1600? Just sitting there. Why did they give Sheridan the time to reorganize? Okay, Tom, good question. Again, this was the fatal halt, and Early Early really thought he had won a victory here, and from his vantage point, what he saw from 5:30 in the morning till about 10:30 in the morning was Union troops running away, offering little resistance except up a little bit near Belle Grove and some more at the cemetery. But I would suspect some of it had to do with not wanting to press his luck, not knowing that Sheridan was back on the way, or that there were more troops that could come and reinforce Union positions from Winchester. And also, he had been criticized significantly for his defeat at Winchester just 4 weeks beforehand, and perhaps he wanted to make it or not be accused of throwing a victory away that he had already won. But what's interesting is that we get from a number of officers after the war, and even right after the battle, they could not believe that they were going to stop. Okay, the Confederates stopping to plunder the Union camps handled their success for the day. Yes, good question, Pete. Or was Sheridan's leadership that made the difference for the Union regardless of the Confederate attack success? Well, two points there. Yes, a good question you brought up was that some of the gas running out of the Confederate attack was because a significant number of soldiers, when they were going through the Union camps, saw the much better supplied, much better fed and provisioned food and drink and shoes and warmer clothing and weaponry in the camps that they had just thrown the Union troops out of. And that continued to happen as they advanced through the camps of the 8th Corps, the 19th Corps, some of the 6th Corps. That weakened them, kind of slowed their momentum. Sheridan's leadership in this one, I think, to answer your question, Pete, and other folks asking that question, had a huge impact, of course, in turning a defeat into victory. His energy, his enthusiasm, his authority, the respect his men had for him, really turned around most, not all, but most of the troops that were leaving the battlefield. And he was able to put them back in line, get organized, and make a counterattack. It does make you wonder, as the other question, as Tom's question was, why so long? What did Early do? Why there wasn't more reconnaissance and to find out whether the Union troops were rallied or whether they were heading back to Winchester, and why no cavalry was sent after them. So part of the what ifs. Was the Vermont cavalry under Custer or Merritt? That, Jim, I do not know. Maybe somebody else knows. I don't believe it was under Custer. I'm glad you mentioned Vermont, though. There was a Vermont brigade here that suffered horrendous casualties during the fighting around Belle Grove and south of Belle Grove. There is a monument to the Vermont troops. In fact, there's even a new historical marker there. Vermont is very proud of their troops and how they fought here. There are several paintings done in the late 19th century of Vermont at Cedar Creek that are in the Vermont State Capitol building that are very dramatic and very impressive. So that's another factor you can see at the battlefield. Another question, what accounts for the effectiveness of the Union cavalry, Spencer rifles, concentration of force, leadership? Very much all three of those, Dave. And the Spencer rifles, for those of you who don't know, those were 7-shot repeaters that didn't have the range of a Enfield or a Springfield musket, but certainly had the firepower and the distance. Leadership too, Custer, Merritt, others, Mack and other cavalry leaders, Gregg, that were at other theaters of Virginia. It was a new, young, hard-hitting group of folks. Kilpatrick, that were also instrumental at Gettysburg. So that absolutely a good point. And I want to thank all of our audience for coming to visit with us this evening for the Battle of Cedar Creek. We're glad you're with us. Thanks to Jen for being our producer tonight. And I hope to see all of you on a future program. So good night.